Good morning. This is December 8th, right? Yep, December 8th, Thursday, and this podcast is being recorded on location at the Lovebirds Bakery and Cafe on Colorado Boulevard in Pasadena, California. And this is going to be part 5 of the Uber killer from the September 2016 issue of GQ magazine. So the Uber driver carried on Uber driving. At 11:30 p.m., Jason Dalton accepted a ride request from a 19-year-old student named Nick. Nick couldn't find the car, so he called Dalton, who said he'd been there and maybe Nick hadn't sent him the right location. Then, at 11:58, Nick was notified that his ride was canceled with a $5 fee. Annoyed, Nick called again. "Oh, report it to Uber," said Dalton. "Okay, bye." At 12:04, Dalton successfully picked up 3 friends who wanted to be taken to one of the dorms at Western Michigan University. They were surprised that Dalton didn't seem to know where he was going. They had to direct him, and they didn't think he was very friendly, but he got them there. Meanwhile, Derek, a law student from Indianapolis, is finishing his night at Bell's Eccentric Cafe. He traveled up earlier in the day with his wife and in-laws to see his wife's stepbrother's jam band. It was after midnight, but it was only a few blocks back to their hotel. They would have walked, but one of the hostesses told them something that made them reconsider. There was an active shooter on the loose. They weren't that worried, but they figured they might as well be prudent and order an Uber. Seemed safest. Derek used his phone, and their ride came up. Jason, Chevy Equinox. Shortly afterward, the driver called. He said he was 5 minutes away and added that, by the way, he wasn't in a Chevy Equinox. They should look out for a black HHR instead. A few minutes later, at 12:12 a.m., Dalton pulled up. Derek got in the front next to Dalton. His father-in-law was behind him. His wife in the middle, and his father-in-law's wife, Sherry, was behind Dalton. Before the journey started, Sherry told her husband, "Hey, don't say anything," because she thought he might. And, of course, he did. "You know, there's a shooter situation going on," he told Dalton. "Yes," Dalton replied. He knew that. To Derek, it seemed a bit awkward, this whole exchange, so trying to make light of it, he chipped in, "You're not the shooter, are you?" "No," Dalton said. That answer, so deadpan and curt, only added to the awkwardness, so Derek doubled down. "Are you sure?" "No, I'm just tired," Dalton replied. He said he'd been driving for 7 hours. After that, they chatted normally, the slightly drunken reveler from out of town, and, next to him, a newborn serial killer with a loaded pistol in the pocket closest to Derek, inches away. "I always make conversation with Uber drivers," said Derek, "because I don't know, it's just awkward when it's quiet. And then there's nothing to raise their suspicions." He drove very carefully. They were dropped off at 12:15, though once again either Dalton or his Uber app messed up because the receipt would show that they continued to be charged as he continued, his car now empty, down Portage Street. "There's really not much funny about this," said Derek, "but the guy overcharged us." 5 days after the shootings, Carol Dalton would file for divorce from her husband of 20 years, not as a reflection of anything at all prior to February 20th, 2016, lawyer Paul Vlachos insisted, but in response to what had happened and to life moving forward and to protecting herself and her children. Vlachos also said that while Dalton's parents were declining to see their son and had gone back to Florida, Carol had visited him twice in jail. The second time she went in, she said, "As you know, we're getting a divorce." He said, they didn't talk about the case. Mark Dunton was out with 2 friends at the Central City Tap House when they decided to move on to Up and Under, more of a roughneck spot. The trip was only a few blocks, but it was cold out, so they called an Uber. They were picked up by Dalton at 12:26. They heard what had been going on in Kalamazoo that night, and they had taken in the specifics of the police warning. They realized that Dalton and his car fit the description. Still, it's a common car. And, anyway, Dalton was an Uber driver. Surely someone on a shooting spree wasn't going around picking up fares. Nevertheless, during the ride, Dunton did ask Dalton, "You're not the guy going around killing people, are you?" "Wow," they remembered Dalton answering. "That is crazy. No way, I'm not that guy." Dalton remembered them, too. Later, he would tell the police that he felt like his passengers were mocking him. In his mind, he said he heard one of them say, "Does he have a gun? Or are you going to shoot me?" But he didn't shoot them. He just drove them to their destination and let them out. During Jason Dalton's first police interview, he'd begun to try to explain anything. Before he'd begun to try to explain anything, he asked if he could call his wife, but as soon as she came on the phone, he ended the call. He said he just wanted to hear her voice. Later, he explained that he wasn't sure what he had or hadn't done, and he was afraid he might have killed his family. For the most part, during the interviews that night, Dalton appeared affectless. But there is one moment, faithfully recorded in the police report, that is eerie and sad in a different way. In between sessions with different officers, during a short interlude when Dalton had been left alone but was still being filmed, he could be heard speaking aloud to himself. The words the police believed they heard him say to the empty room, "Sorry to you, my love." Sergeant James Harrison didn't normally work in the city, but he'd been called into town to investigate a report of a shooting, another incident entirely, nothing to do with Dalton. As it turned out, not even a real one. Prank call. Happens. But like everyone else working in law enforcement in Kalamazoo that night, he was now on the lookout. Harrison was idling at the stoplight on the corner of Main and Michigan when he happened to turn and spotted something over his right shoulder, a black Chevy HHR about to pull out of the up and under parking lot. In a bar a few blocks away, Mallory Lemieux, a student at Western Michigan, was enjoying a mother-daughter night out with several other friends, 7 girls, 7 mothers. Lemieux noticed her father had been calling and texting since the previous bar, so she went to the bathroom to find out what was up. A shooter on the loose, 7 people believed dead. Her father told her what was right now being talked about on the news, a Chevy HHR driven by an older male. The moms and daughters decided to hit just one more spot, the Wild Bull, then call it a night. Her dad kept phoning, increasingly worried, and by now the other women were getting calls and texts too, so she summoned a cab. At 12:33, Lemieux's Uber request was accepted by the nearest driver, and his information came up on her phone. Jason, Chevy Equinox. When Lemieux saw the word Chevy and Jason's picture, she panicked. She did notice that the Uber app was telling her, wrongly, that the car on its way was a Chevy Equinox, not an HHR. But as far as she was concerned, Chevy anything was too close. She canceled the ride and tried to rebook a different driver. At 12:34, her new request was accepted. Jason, Chevy Equinox. She canceled again. On her Uber app, she could see the car icon move right past where she and her group were waiting. Meanwhile, Sergeant Harrison trailed Dalton as he circled the Wild Bull. Harrison had no idea that Dalton was an Uber driver. There was every reason to worry that this person might be going from one Kalamazoo night spot to another, scoping out new victims. I'm like, oh shit, Harrison would later tell his colleagues, because there's 30 or 40 people standing outside the Wild Bull. But instead, Dalton headed north, then took a right turn down Ransom Street into the quieter industrial and business district northeast of downtown. He was listening to the radio, open house party on 103.3 FM. There's no signs that he noticed Sergeant Harrison behind him or the second car of Sergeant Scott Miller, who had just joined the pursuit. At 12:38, Mallory Lemieux tried Uber one more time. Jason, Chevy Equinox. This time, though, she noticed something odd. The car icon was not moving toward her on the map. In fact, it had stopped moving entirely. No matter, he was an older man in a Chevy. She canceled a final time. In the days after his arrest, Jason Dalton's court-appointed lawyer would apply on his behalf for a competency test. Not yet to consider his mental state when these acts were committed, but merely to judge whether he had the mental capacity to understand legal proceedings. Dalton told the psychologist who interviewed him about the app how it had taken over his body and controlled his actions. Asked whether this was possible or whether his mind could have been playing tricks on him, Dalton sounded like someone who was slowly beginning to wake up. That's what I've been trying to work through. I guess that's the heavy part. I believed at the time I was experiencing something. I'm not sure what that is. In the cell, it's heavy thinking about if I was imagining those things or if they were real. The psychologist found Dalton competent to stand trial. Just after 12:37 a.m., a few hundred yards away from where Mallory Lemieux was about to cancel her ride for the third and final time, Sergeant Harrison flipped on his lights to make a police call a felony stop. Dalton pulled over almost immediately. The 2 police cars pulled in behind Dalton and, after a pregnant minute, ordered the driver to put his hand out of the window. Dalton complied. At 12:38 a.m., Harrison, gun drawn, covered by Sergeant Miller, his gun also drawn, slowly edged toward Dalton's car, then grabbed Dalton's wrists. "Do you have anything on you?" Miller asked. but Dalton just stared blankly ahead. Patting him down, Harrison found the pistol. "Gun," he announced, and placed it on the roof of Dalton's car. Then Dalton was handcuffed, and Harrison led him to the police car. As Harrison searched Dalton some more, one of his colleagues walked by and gave Harrison a fist bump. The call went over the police radio. "One detained, firearm on person." After Dalton was put in a car and driven away, the officers who remained at the scene seemed surprised and maybe disappointed that such a violent and terrible situation could have ended so quietly. Snatches of their conversations could be heard on the police car audio, the officers still adrenalized as they talked through what happened. "He had a bulletproof vest on. I can't believe we didn't have a effing gun battle out there." "Oh man, could you get a better effing backdrop? Brick building, metal building, no residential." "Dude, I'm going to tell you right now, I really wanted to mimes firing his gun several times. I was like, you effing piece of S." When he stopped here, I was like, game on. We would have effing obliterated his ass. But he didn't say a single thing when we pulled him over. I can't believe he didn't go out in a blaze of glory. They also discussed whether more bodies would be found. Somebody mentioned that officers were checking all over the other parking lots along Stadium Drive. "He's got to have killed his wife and everything," said one. "I would think so," came the reply. As the news came through that his wife had been successfully contacted, "She's a 14, Kalamazoo Police Code confirming she's okay." They sounded perplexed. Cops at the Cellier scene were also surprised. Clearly this is not how they anticipated the night would end. "He didn't fight us? I'm surprised that he didn't want to go at it. I figured he would be suicide by cop. Wow, that's an effing puss." In the months since his arrest, there's been little sign that Jason Dalton might offer a clearer account of his motives. At a pretrial hearing in late May, Dalton interrupted the testimony of Tiana Carruthers, who was sitting in the witness box a few yards from him, and who was beginning to describe how he shot her with a seemingly nonsensical outburst. "No," Dalton cried out. "They gave bags. These old people, they have these old black bags that are called, they're black. They're black bags that people drive around and people look at them. It gets real bad. It's time people look, and that's when they tell people it's time to get to Temple." Then he appeared to try to break free of his restraints, repeatedly shouting, "Take," at Carruthers, who had burst into terrified tears, and jabbing his right forefinger at her in a way that seemed to resemble someone firing a gun. After that, he had to be dragged from the courtroom, his body dead weight, legs trailing on the floor. For the rest of the hearing, once it reconvened, he appeared by video link, flanked on either side by a law enforcement official, each with a hand on one of his shoulders. A few weeks later, a new peculiar detail emerged. If true, an almost cliched serial killer precursor. Someone told the police that Dalton had once talked of choking and killing the family cat, then leaving it on the marital bed. Asked about this, his wife confirmed that 6 or 7 years ago she had found their cat, Leo, dead, lying where it usually slept on their bed. She assumed it had died of natural causes. In early June, it was confirmed that Dalton would be offering an insanity defense, though the bar for proving that Dalton was legally insane when he committed these crimes, given all the methodical acts that punctuated the day, might be a high one. At trial, he can be convicted without us ever knowing why he did what he did. "Legally, I don't have to prove a motive," said the Kalamazoo prosecutor, Jeff Getting. "I have to prove he did it. I have to prove premeditation, deliberation. Legally, that's what's important. The reality is there's a want to explain it, but that's not something I have to prove in court. We'll continue to look for explanations, but I'm not sure we'll ever get a good one." Jason Dalton later tried to explain why he had allowed himself to be arrested without a fight. He said that he did reach to his right side for his gun when he was pulled over, but then, once again, something happened with his phone. In one police interview, he said that it beeped. In another, he said his app turned from black to red. At that moment, he felt like he was no longer being guided. As the report summarized, Dalton said that was the reason he didn't shoot the officer. Everyone still wants a reason. Of course we do. A reason helps us to know how to feel, helps us to know where to put an experience like this. A reason reassures us that it can't happen again. Not easily anyway, not often. And maybe that kind of reason will come. Maybe some more information will surface, medical, situational, ideological, biographical, that will help us understand. Experts of various kinds will be invited to explain or name Dalton's behavior in ways he cannot. When we can't explain something, we often pretend by finding clever words to describe it. Maybe we'll even convince ourselves that we've learned